In many of my past videos, I have covered real-world cultures, ideas, and institutions of various nation-states on this normal planet. However, in this video series, I'm going to cover the cultures, customs, and factions of a fictional world, the World of Warcraft. In doing so, we can see how real-life nations, empires, cultures, and civilizations inspire the game, as well as appreciate the knowledge and creativity that is required for world building. In the fictional universe of World of Warcraft, most factions are divided roughly into what we call races, but perhaps a better term would be species. Granted, the game developers probably thought the term species would sound a little bit too scientific for a fantasy world. Generally speaking, the term race in the World of Warcraft does not refer to the more fluid, quasi-socially constructed category of race in our world, but rather an essentialist category, completely based off of nature. Well, the nature of the World of Warcraft, at least. Another point is that not all of these races are one coherent culture, let alone one unified political entity. There are, for example, several human kingdoms, and several orc clans, in a similar way that there are several numerous Arabic-speaking states. There are also members of these races that are not aligned with the main political entity of their race that you can play as, and some are actively opposed. This works the same with our world. Some nations have civil wars, rebellions, and secessions. Now let's move on to each major playable race, and what the real-world culture they reflect says about human popular culture, and our understanding of our own world. So, let's start off with one that we are all familiar with even if you don't play the game, humans. I'm assuming everyone watching this video is a human. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like most fantasy worlds, humans from our world are essentially imported into a fictional setting. And like many in this genre, these humans are loosely based off of the cultures of medieval England, and more generally Europe. Most of the early writers of high fantasy like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were primarily inspired by the history and lore of their own culture on the British Isles. Tolkien was a philologist who specialized in Germanic and to a lesser extent Celtic languages, and you can see much of this in Lord of the Rings, along with other high fantasy art that has been inspired by it. Now, obviously, England under the Saxons was very different than it was under the Vikings and then the Normans, but details don't really matter when you're dealing with a fictional world that is simply inspired by it, let alone a game where the developers have to apply the inspiration loosely and make it work with the game mechanics. For example, the warriors and paladins in the World of Warcraft have plate armor. However, plate armor was not used in our world until the early modern age. Granted, any real-world person that would be generally bothered by this probably needs to get a job and lift some weights. Anyway, nonetheless, the inspiration from medieval England can clearly be seen well beyond the costumes, and more into the architecture, with their castles, keeps, walls, towers, homesteads, lumber mills, farms, and inns. The capital and centerpiece of the most powerful human kingdom is Stormwind, which has some similarities to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, due to its canals and its large seaport. Unfortunately, Stormwind does not have any weed cafes or a red light district. Now, obviously the Netherlands is not in England, however it has quite a lot of ties with English history, as after all, they are both Germanic peoples who would eventually adopt first Christianity and then specifically Protestant Christianity later on. Overall, though, I'd still say that they're more inspired by the British Isles, like most fantasy genres do. Overall, Stormwind's economic system seems to be feudalist. Feudalism was a dominant economic system of the Middle Ages. You had God on top, and then the church and the king, with the king managing secular affairs and the church managing religious affairs. Then you had higher nobles, lower nobles, and then you had a large swath of serfs toiling along the fields. The priest class provided a sort of religious inspiration to tie the community together, and the knights would be another class of peoples hired by the nobility to defend the lands, oftentimes against other nobles and their knights. Lo and behold, Stormwind has a king, it has nobility, it has peasants, and you can play as a knight in the form of a paladin or as a priest. Both paladins and priests are playable classes in the game. If you combine a priest and a knight, you get a paladin, which is a major archetype in the game. They practice a religion called the Light, as most humans do in this universe. The Light seems to be more of an impersonal force rather than an actual personal god, let alone Trinity. Nonetheless, like Jesus from the Bible, the Light does have healing powers. In this religion, the Light seems to be heavily inspired by Christianity, but not so much in terms of its theology, but more in terms of its administration, with bishops and priests. Along with that, its architecture is also quite Christian-esque, particularly Anglican, the Church of England, and you can see this with the steeples of their churches and cathedrals, namely the Cathedral of Light in Stormwind, which is quite reminiscent again of an aforementioned Anglican church. Like Christianity, this religion of light tends to place a great deal of importance on forgiveness, sacrifice, and charity. However, like Christianity, the light can also be hijacked by fundamentalists for extremist purposes, such as the Scarlet Crusade in Lordaeron. While the humans of Stormwind are the main playable faction of humans, there are several other kingdoms that have existed in the past and present. Most of these fall under the same sort of cultural context, with some political differences here and there. However, there are a few outliers. The kingdom of Erethdor in Arathi Highland seems to be more inspired by the British Isles before the arrival of Germanic peoples or even the Romans. A lot of this area has a lot of places that look like Stonehenge, if you could call them that, and they're quite reminiscent of pre-Celtic Britain. It was a pretty brilliant idea of the game designers to base a culture of the oldest human kingdom off of an area that resembles Europe before the arrival of Indo-Europeans. Another human kingdom is called Kultiris, which has a maritime culture. This political system is known as a thalaocracy. I'm not quite sure if I'm pronouncing that word properly, which basically nonetheless refers to rule by whoever controls the seas. As a result, the guys who run the merchant ships and the naval vessels run this kingdom. There have been many maritime powers throughout history, like the Phoenicians from what is now Lebanon, to the Polynesians of Hawaii, but Kultiris seems to be more inspired by the early English Empire when it comes to exerting their control over the open ocean. It also takes a great deal of similarity to colonial New England, as states like Massachusetts and Rhode Island produce some of the best whaling expeditions in the world. Oh, and one more thing worth pointing out, the humans in this game have plenty of modern anachronisms. An anachronism is basically something that doesn't fit in with this time and place. For example, in the World of Warcraft, men and women have equal rights under the law, and for some reason they also have American accents, despite the fact that this is loosely based off of the Middle Ages, or at the very least has a medieval aesthetic. But then again, would medieval people really sound anything like modern English people? Probably not. Another playable race are the Worgen, who are basically humans turned into werewolves. Werewolves are found in various forms of Indo-European folklore, as people who interacted with Eurasian grey wolves would oftentimes have stories to tell about grey wolves. After all, grey wolves are common in temperate latitudes. In the game, they're still technically humans, although from the kingdom of Gilneas. However, unlike other human kingdoms, their architecture, fashion, and customs seem to be heavily inspired by the Victorian era, long after the Middle Ages ended. This is a time in the mid to late 1800s. Now let's move on to a genuinely different race, the dwarves. These dwarves are clearly inspired by those of Dungeons & Dragons as well as Lord of the Rings, which in turn are inspired by the dwarves of Norse mythology. Famed for their role as craftsmen and miners, and oftentimes living underground, they're known as being a rough and rugged people. In the game, they have Scottish accents, and anyone who has a Scottish accent kind of sounds badass to me. So I'd suppose that a lot of their culture, despite coming from Scandinavia, seems to be somewhat more similar to those of Celtic peoples. After all, a lot of their landscape looks like the Scottish Highlands. They also have lakes that are called lochs, like Loch Ness in Scotland. Living nearby the dwarves are the gnomes. This race is not heavily inspired by any real-world culture, but rather a subculture or fictional aesthetic called steampunk. Steampunk combines the technology and aesthetics of the Victorian British period of the mid to late 1800s, that revolves around steam engines and fashion like top hats, along with weird futuristic technology. Gnomes, along with goblins, prefer technology over magic in the game, and given that the World of Warcraft is all about magic, they tend to be more sidelined and more reserved for comic relief rather than actual serious lore. Moving on to a race that actually does have serious lore behind it, the Night Elves, which are my personal favorite. The culture of the Night Elves doesn't really fit in with any existing real-world culture particularly smoothly, but rather combines elements of various real-world cultures into something that is very unique and creative. Their culture is very in tune with nature and nocturnal. And at first and foremost, their society is matriarchal, meaning that they're ruled by women. This is very rare in the real world. Oftentimes when you hear of matriarchal societies, they're from mythology. One of the most notable examples of this are the Amazons of Greek mythology. In this sort of society, the women do most of the governing and make up the bulk of the work related to material matters, like hunting, fishing, and fighting. Similar again to the Amazons of Greek mythology. They also worship a moon goddess called Elune. After all, various cultures around the world tend to attribute the moon to divine feminine characteristics. One notable example of this is the Roman goddess Luna. The male Night Elves, on the other hand, practice Druidism. Druidism was common in pre-Roman, pre-Christian Britain. This was predominantly practiced by Celtic peoples. Now, the Druids in World of Warcraft take some inspiration from Celtic culture. They believe in a parallel mental state, a different plane of existence called the Emerald Dream, a world untouched by intelligent life. And it's not a surprise that the Druids in our real world also work kind of like the masters of nature in the eyes of those who practice the faith. However, you can't simply compare Night Elves to Celtic peoples in our real world, as there are a lot of other elements of their culture that are clearly inspired by others. Their architecture, for example, is obviously inspired by either Korean, Japanese, or a combination of both forms of architecture. And by and large, they also have a long history of isolation and xenophobia until recently that is not too different from that of Japanese history. The last major alliance race played in the game are the Draenei. These are oftentimes mocked as blue space goats. The reason for this appearance is that they are modeled after the appearance of the demons in the game. According to the lore, the demons were once Draenei who had fallen into the ways of corruption and evil. So the game designers pretty much reversed engineered the lore to fit them in. Brilliant move, Blizzard. The background story is that the Draenei worshipped the light, but some strayed away from the light and sought out the corrupting influence of evil magic, known as fel magic. Those of you who are familiar with Christian cosmology can probably see some of the parallels between this story in World of Warcraft and those of the fallen angels in the Bible, particularly the book of Revelations from the Bible, which is the last book of the entire Bible. Funny enough, Satan isn't actually mentioned directly in the Old Testament, but rather is retconned in the New Testament as a sort of figure who rebels against God before getting his ass kicked, and then Michael the Archangel has to kick him out and send him to hell. The fallen angels are now known as demons. Even if you aren't Christian or know very little about Christianity, you're probably familiar with the fallen angel trope that is a basis in the book of Revelations, popularized by John Milton's Paradise Lost, and has been referenced countless times in pop culture. Demons in Western folklore are heavily inspired by the satyrs of Greek mythology as well, and satyrs basically are perverted goatmen. Since the Draenei have their model based off of demons, and those in turn are based off of the models of satyrs, then it makes sense that Draenei would look like goat people with hooves. Although I still don't know why they're blue. I'm guessing it's because demons are usually depicted being red, so they just pick the opposite color to signify that these are the good guys, the good space goat people. I couldn't really figure out what their architecture was based off of. I think it's just some generic sci-fi aesthetic. But they do have Russian accents for some reason. So I'm just going to end the video with some Russian accents by Blue Space Goat people. Enjoy.
Friend, you are welcome here. Belayadoros. Please browse my wares. How can I help?